It's a man, baby.
I am so sorry. Did you know that Austin Powers is 23 years old? Yeah. But I digress. Yes, there is a new MAGA conspiracy theory, and yes, it is insanely dumb.
The initial reaction to your series was, well, that now we know Candace is insane.
But this one is going to be tested in the courts. Now, it is extremely difficult to defame a public figure, let alone the head of state like the president of France, but Candace Owens might have found a way. Yes, after getting kicked out of the Daily Wire for peddling your run-of-the-mill anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, Candace turned it up to 11 with a bold new conspiracy theory. The First Lady of France isn't actually a lady at all. She's secretly a man who stole his sister's identity and is now working undercover to manipulate her husband on behalf of the global cabal of liberal elite pedophiles. And that's just the beginning. Trust me, it gets dumber. And so last week, the First Lady of France, Brigitte Macron, and her husband, French President Emmanuel Macron, fired back by filing a monster 219-page defamation complaint against Owens. Now, we've read the complaint, and oh boy, it's certainly a greatest hits compilation of MAGA's favorite tinfoil hat club talking points. So get your MAGA conspiracy theory bingo cards ready, because we're going to check off a lot of boxes as we analyze the Macrons' case against Candace Owens, and what happens when the lines between protected speech and defamation blur. Now, while the United States is a net importer of goods, one of its greatest exports is conspiracy theories. But the Brigitte Macron is a man claim actually started in France. Like the US, France has a group of extreme right-wing anti-government conspiracy theorists who peddle wild ideas online. And the post-COVID era of political distrust created even more fertile grounds for those conspiracy theories. And Brigitte Macron and her husband have often been the subject of salacious media stories. Because when they met, and this is not a conspiracy theory, this is actual real life, Emmanuel was a 15-year-old student and Brigitte, his drama teacher, was married with 3 children, the oldest of whom was older than Emmanuel. He told Brigitte he would return to marry her when he left for school in Paris at the age of 17. And years later, she divorced her first husband and married him. Now that's wild enough on its own, but conspiracy theorists led by Nacha Ray, an essential oil saleswoman who claims to be an independent journalist, turned this legitimately scandalous backstory into a wild fiction about Brigitte secretly being a man named Jean-Michel who stole his sister's identity. And in December 2021, Ray did a YouTube interview with Amandine Roy, a self-professed spiritual medium. And they speculated, with no evidence at all, that Brigitte Macron is really a man whose name is Jean-Michel Troneau. Now, within hours, that interview spawned a trending hashtag and got 500,000 views. Brigitte Macron and her brother, the real Jean-Michel Troneau, fought back with a defamation lawsuit against Ray and Roy. A Paris court found the 2 women guilty and ordered them to pay damages. But the French appeals court later acquitted them on the grounds that their statements didn't meet the French legal standard for defamation. Brigitte Macron and her brother have appealed that finding to France's highest court. Now, those first defamation cases, though, did nothing to stop the rampant conspiracy theories about Brigitte. Far-right French writer Xavier Possard and others worked to make this fringe theory a worldwide phenomenon. And when Candace Owens heard about it, she was happy to help. Now, Owens is a darling of the far-right. She previously worked as the communications director at Turning Point USA, an organization that advocates for conservative ideas in high schools and colleges. And for a while, she was at the Daily Wire, but when she started peddling anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that didn't go over too well with the company's founder, Ben Shapiro. Now, according to the Macrons' lawsuit, Owens was the first person to popularize this conspiracy theory in the United States, proclaiming that it was, quote, the biggest political scandal in human history. Now, Owens claimed she'd learned about the conspiracy theory from an article in a conservative newspaper, the Daily Mail. Ironically, that article was meant to debunk the theory, not to support it. But facts be damned, Owens apparently decided to go all in. She declared on Twitter that she would, quote, stake her entire professional reputation on the fact that Brigitte Macron is in fact a man. And she might get her wish. Now, the secretly a man conspiracy theory is surprisingly popular in the MAGAverse. There's even a name for it. Transvestigation. People currently under Transvestigation include Michelle Obama, former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga, and Serena Williams, giving more fodder to the theory that when they ask what is a woman, they actually have no idea and are just curious. And so after her departure from the Daily Wire, Owens launched her own podcast called Candace and ran with the Brigitte Macron is a man as the fledgling podcast's central focus. Now, throughout the summer of 2024, Owens repeated her claims about Brigitte Macron. She sold t-shirts with a picture of Brigitte as Time Magazine's Man of the Year. She announced that the Macrons are part of a, quote, very small group of elite oligarchs who routinely practice homosexuality and pedophilia, believe in Baphomet, and worship a transgender deity.
I hate the phrase global elite because it sounds so spooky or whatever.
And she cross-pollinated the Macron-related conspiracy theories with Alex Jones. In August of 2024, Owens invited Xavier Poussard onto her podcast, where Poussard, who had worked for years to promote the Brigitte is a man conspiracy theory in France, helped Candace really flesh out the nuances of the larger conspiracy. They agreed that the Macrons were perpetrating a fraud regarding Brigitte's identity, and that Emmanuel Macron is being controlled by Brigitte or possibly some larger cabal. They went further and pointed out the close resemblance between Emmanuel Macron and Brigitte's nephew, and implied that the resemblance proves that Brigitte is secretly blood related to Emmanuel, and thus the relationship is also incestuous. Now, when YouTube removed this video for violating its content policies, Candace doubled down, claiming that this was just part of the media conspiracy to cover up pedophilia. So in December of 2024, the Macrons sent Owens a detailed retraction letter filled with evidence debunking Owens' claims.
We missed the letter because they sent it to an inbox that we would have never been checking. It was a very weird inbox, like where you would go to return a t-shirt. And because we missed that.
Yeah, and reading between the lines here, I'm guessing that they sent it to her registered agent for service of process. And yeah, that's definitely something that you should be checking, and doesn't bode well that you're not attentive to these kinds of things. The letter included Brigitte's birth announcement, as well as a bunch of pictures of her as a young girl, a picture of her married to her first husband, and what should have been the coup de grace to the conspiracy theory that Brigitte is secretly a man, a reminder that Brigitte had birthed 3 children during her first marriage.
Like you don't have any photos of yourself for 30 years of your life.
But instead of backing down in the face of evidence, Owens decided to create an 8-part series on her podcast exposing all of the Macrons' nefarious lies. But if you find yourself looking down the barrel of a MAGA conspiracy, you might want to remove your online data lest you get doxxed by Candace Owens and the like. Because data brokers vacuum up your personal data from all corners of the internet, and they sell it to anyone who wants to buy it. But you can fight back and take control of your personal data by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Because Incogni removes your personal data from online data brokers by searching the internet, reaching out directly on your behalf, and forcing them to take your personal info down. If the data brokers resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. These data brokers are the reason why in the US you can search your name and find a bunch of websites that will give anyone your home address, phone number, and extensive history. It's shocking just how easy it is to find all this information. It might also be why you're getting so many spam calls lately or even had your identity stolen. Now, I've been using Incogni for years, and in that time you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns for me over the years, and I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks of work in adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals, because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you click on the link on screen or down below, you can try Incogni risk-free for 30 days with a 60% off discount and get a full refund if you're not into it. And if you do decide to keep it, you'll still get the exclusive 60% off discount so long as you use my link or the code LegalEagle, all one word, at checkout. So sign up for Incogni or I'll see you in court. Now, over the course of these 8 episodes, Candace really built out the full mythology of her conspiracy theories about the Macrons. Now, in Delaware, where the Macrons eventually filed their defamation lawsuit, defamation typically has 4 elements. First, the defendant made a defamatory statement. Second, the statement concerned the plaintiff. Third, the statement was published. And fourth, a third party would understand the character of the communication as defamatory. Now, while there are exceptions for a statement to be defamatory, it generally needs to be a verifiable statement of fact as opposed to an unverifiable opinion. And there are a lot of potentially defamatory statements of fact in Owens's conspiracy theory. Because according to this conspiracy theory, Brigitte Macron is actually Jean-Michel Trudeau, and she's a blood relation of Emmanuel Macron. At some point after his gender transition, Jean-Michel stole his sister's identity and began living as Brigitte. Jean-Michel, as 40-year-old Brigitte, then seduced 14-year-old Emmanuel Macron. She apparently seduced Emmanuel because she was grooming him on behalf of a global cabal of pedophile elites who wanted a Manchurian candidate they could control. These elites included the powerful Jewish Rothschild family, who also, according to Owens, practice incest and have a close connection to Emmanuel Macron.
They said that it was just very clear that the hand of Rothschild was on him.
But according to Owens, Brigitte didn't just use seduction to control Emmanuel. She also apparently used mind control, possibly in the form of psychedelics like the US government's experimental MK-Ultra program. MK-Ultra, by the way, was a real program by the United States Central Intelligence Agency that experimented on unsuspecting victims, giving them doses of hallucinogens without their consent and subjecting them to various forms of attempted mind control. In the real world, this program officially ended in 1973. In conspiracy land, it is ongoing and has been used to control puppet leaders of supposedly democratic countries like France.
He is, to me, like a Zelensky. He's totally powerless. There's somebody in the shadows telling him what to do.
But according to Owens, Emmanuel Macron isn't the only leader under the influence of MKUltra. As Owens argued in episode 5 of her 8-part series, quote, there are too many similarities between the upbringing of Emmanuel Macron and as we talked about the upbringing of Kamala Harris, the upbringing of Barack Obama, these people being raised by their grandparents at a time when we know that the MKUltra program was running and there is something very, very wrong there. Owens also claimed that when so-called journalists began investigating the Macrons' nefarious deeds, the Macrons had them killed. As evidence of this, Owens cited the suicide of one conspiracy theorist. In February of 2025 and on July 1st, 2025, the Macrons sent Owens 2 more retraction demand letters. And the lawyer actually had to write the following sentence, quote, Mrs. Macron has always been a woman. She is not President Macron's blood relative, and President Macron was not involved in a mind control program. Owens responded publicly by declaring that, quote, we are not getting in line. We've said, file your lawsuits, my friend. So a few weeks later, the Macrons took her up on that invitation. On July 23rd, 2025, the Macrons filed a 219-page complaint against Candace Owens and her 2 businesses in Delaware State Court. The Macrons alleged 22 counts of defamation and false light related to Owens' 8-part podcast series.
Hunter kind of notoriously said, we control the courts in Delaware.
Now, why Delaware, you might ask? Well, Owens claimed it's because the Bidens control the Delaware courts, but it's more likely that the Macrons filed there because both of Candace's businesses are organized under Delaware state law. This gives the state court's jurisdiction over Candace and her businesses. The statute of limitations for defamation in Delaware is 2 years, which allows the Macrons to pull in all of Owens' statements about Brigitte, including several things Candace said before she left the Daily Wire. Now, to prove the first element of Delaware defamation law, the Macrons will have to show that Owens' statements were defamatory. To determine this, Delaware courts must consider first whether alleged defamatory statements are expressions of fact or protected expressions of opinion, and second, whether the challenged statements are capable of a defamatory meaning. To determine if a statement is defamatory, a judge will look at both the words and the context in which they're published. Now, Candace Owens will have a hard time claiming that her words were mere opinion, especially when she says things like, quote, I would stake my entire professional reputation on the fact that Brigitte Macron is in fact a man. Now, Owens isn't claiming to be professing an opinion, and she's claiming that it's a fact that Brigitte Macron is a man. Now, while being a man or being transgender does not necessarily carry negative connotations sufficient to qualify as defamatory, the context in which Candace Owens made these statements matters. Owens claimed that in order to falsely assume a female identity, Brigitte had stolen someone else's identity and that she was perpetrating a fraud on the French people. That certainly seems to have the implication of dishonesty and perhaps even criminality that would qualify as defamation. Now, the Macrons also argued that it was defamatory when Owens exaggerated their age gap, arguing that Owens, quote, lied about the age difference between the Macrons, claiming that Emmanuel was 14 and that Brigitte was 40 when they met. Now, those numbers are maybe not as far off as we would like them to be, but they are wrong. And according to the Macrons' own public statements, he was 15 and she was 39 when they met and potentially became romantically involved. And the question of whether he was 14 or 15 would be legally relevant under France's current law, which sets the age of consent at 15. But the law was only put in place in 2021. Before 2021, an adult could have relations with a 14-year-old, and as long as there was no physical force or threat, it wasn't legally considered statutory rape. It was a lesser charge. Under the older French law, though, even if Emmanuel was 15, any sexual relationship with Brigitte would still have been illegal under a lesser charge. That's because as a teacher, she was in a position of authority over him, and when a person is in a position of authority, the age of consent is higher. But it's a little strange that the Macrons carved out some space in the complaint to single out this single factual dispute, because whether he was 14 or 15 probably wouldn't matter to the reasonable observer, and likely doesn't matter legally here in the United States. It just calls more attention to the legitimately scandalous beginning of their relationship. Now, the second element seems pretty straightforward, that the statements were about the plaintiffs. Here, Candace helpfully named her podcast series Becoming Brigitte, and she name checks the Macrons whenever possible. To establish the third element of defamation in Delaware, the Macrons need to show that the defamatory language was published to a third party. This is why several paragraphs of the complaint detail how big Owens' audience is and how many platforms carried her series about the Macrons. Candace wasn't just writing mean things about the Macrons in her personal journal, she was working hard to publicize her defamatory statements to an audience of millions. She even went on other people's shows and podcasts to expand her reach. And her strategy worked. Even Joe Rogan, one of the most listened to and most credulous podcasters in the world, discussed Owens' claims and said that he believed them.
She's got a 6-hour presentation on how Brigitte Macron is a man. I mean, it's fucking 6 hours plus long.
I don't know if she's even kind of right about that.
I think she's right.
But she's got a lot of shit to say on it.
Bro, she would be getting sued right now instead of they're trying to bribe her. Instead of trying to give her money to shut the fuck up,
Yeah.
they would sue her.
Yeah. No, you're probably right about that.
So here, Owens clearly shared her defamatory statements with not only a third party, but a huge audience. Which leaves the fourth element. The Macrons will need to prove that a third party would understand the character of the communication as defamatory. Now, this doesn't mean that they have to prove that Owens herself would have to understand that her statements were defamatory. Owens can't escape liability just by claiming, for instance, that she thought her words were just opinions, or that she believed that they were true, or she doesn't think that it's a bad thing. But she might try the tactic that Alex Jones tried in one of his defamation trials, claiming that no reasonable person would actually believe that she was being serious when she said those things. But under Delaware law, it's unlikely to work because it doesn't matter if she thought that the statements were defamatory, it matters if an average third party would. In Delaware, a plaintiff must only prove that a neutral third party would understand the nature of the statements as defamatory. And it seems pretty likely that most reasonable people would recognize that accusing someone of murdering journalists and being part of a global cabal of mind-controlling incestuous pedophiles who kill their sisters and take over their bodies as pretty defamatory. But the Macrons shouldn't break out the French champagne yet. Even if they can prove these four elements, they've got an uphill legal battle in front of them. Now, as we've talked about many times on this channel, the US law has to balance free speech with defamation law. So courts in the United States have set a high standard for defamation, particularly when the derogatory comments are directed at public figures. So in Delaware, when the plaintiff is a public figure, they have to show two additional elements: that the statement is false and that the defendant made the statement with actual malice. Now, these extra elements are required because of the landmark Supreme Court case of New York Times versus Sullivan. In 1960, the Times ran an advertisement criticizing the Montgomery, Alabama police for their treatment of civil rights protesters, including Martin Luther King Jr. The ad contained several minor factual inaccuracies, including how many times King had been arrested during the protests and what song the protesters had sung. Based on those inaccuracies, Montgomery County Police Commissioner L.B. Sullivan sued the Times, claiming defamation. Now, after two lower courts ruled against the Times, the Supreme Court stepped in. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the Times. The court held that the definition of defamation has to be narrow because the, quote, profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Even if that debate includes, quote, vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasant sharp attacks on government and public officials, it still needs to be protected. To ensure that speech was adequately protected, the court created the requirement that if a public official wants to claim defamation, they have to show actual malice. Now, in defamation law, as we've talked about many times before, malice doesn't mean malicious intent. It means that the defendant had knowledge of the falsity of the claim or acted in gross recklessness. And in Curtis Publishing Co. versus Butts and other later cases, the Supreme Court expanded the high bar for defamation claims to all public figures, not just public officials. This includes celebrities, prominent people, or anyone who knowingly inserts themselves into a public controversy. So an ordinary person can even be a limited purpose public figure if they voluntarily inject themselves or are drawn into a particular public controversy. But once someone is classified as a public figure, it becomes much more difficult for them to win the defamation case. Now, Emmanuel Macron, as president of France, is certainly a public official and a public figure. And while a court might not consider all family members of politicians to be public figures per se, Brigitte's actions would likely qualify her as a public figure. And courts will often look at whether a person has given public interviews or otherwise put themselves in the public eye. One Delaware court in Martin versus Widener School of Law, for instance, found that a law student who voluntarily did an interview with a newspaper about his dispute with his law school had made himself a limited purpose public figure related to that dispute. Now, Brigitte is often by her husband's side at public and political events, and according to the Macron's complaint, quote, Mrs. Macron joined her husband on the campaign trail, acting as a central figure and key advisor to his campaign. The complaint also acknowledges that, quote, Mrs. Macron represents France in diplomatic settings, supports charitable causes, and engages in initiatives related to education, health, disability, and child protection. So as a public figure, she's gonna have to demonstrate that Candace Owens acted with actual malice.
Obviously, if you're going to prove actual malice, you have to present to the court, which is, it's obviously a very high bar that's been set, which I don't necessarily even agree with that bar, by the way, New York Times versus Sullivan set. But obviously you have to prove that I acted, I knew the truth and I acted.
That's exactly right.
And under Delaware law, that means the Macrons will have to show that Owens either knew her claims were untrue or that she acted with gross recklessness. And recklessness is part of that standard to prevent someone from being able to defeat a defamation claim by just sticking their head in the sand and ignoring all of the contrary evidence, which is probably one of the reasons that the Macrons sent 3 letters explicitly debunking her claims. And in the complaint, the Macrons recount the contents of those letters, which include written statements debunking Owens' claims, as well as evidence like pictures of Brigitte as a child, Brigitte's birth announcement, and photos of her first wedding, demonstrating that she is, and always has been, female. And the Macrons also reference the numerous times that Owens ignored contrary evidence as she peddled her conspiracy theories. This could help demonstrate that even if Owens truly believed that her claims were accurate, she's still acting with gross recklessness by disregarding all of the evidence to the contrary. There's still the question, though, of who will have the burden of demonstrating whether Owens' claims were true or false. Truth is a widely accepted defense to any defamation claim, and something is true, it cannot, generally speaking, by legal definition, be defamatory. Now, traditionally, the defendant has had the burden of proving that their statements were actually true, but after New York Times versus Sullivan, courts began to reconsider who should carry the burden when the plaintiff is a public figure and the defendant is a member of the media. In Philadelphia Newspapers versus Hepps, the Supreme Court considered the case of Maurice Hepps, the owner of a chain of stores. The Philadelphia Inquirer had published a series of articles linking the stores and Hepps to organized crime and accusing Hepps of using his organized crime connections to influence the legislature. Hepps sued for defamation. Now, at the time, Pennsylvania state law put the burden on the newspapers to demonstrate that his claims were true. The Supreme Court declared that this burden was an unconstitutional infringement on free speech and instead placed the burden on Hepps. The court concluded that, quote, to ensure that true speech on matters of public concern is not deterred, we hold that the common law presumption that defamatory speech is false cannot stand when a plaintiff seeks damages against a media defendant for speech of public concern. And the case turned partly on the fact that the defendant was a member of the media, which raises the interesting question, is Candace Owens a member of the media? Is this a matter of public concern? Owens holds herself out as an independent journalist, even claiming that the Macrons lawsuit is, quote, a foreign government attacking the First Amendment rights of an American independent journalist. Though plaintiffs seem to be teeing up the argument that Owens actually isn't a journalist. In their complaint, they argue that Owens was, quote, motivated by personal animus rather than any legitimate journalistic practice, and say that, quote, Owens labels herself as an independent investigative journalist while routinely peddling misinformation under the guise of legitimate reporting. So if the Macrons can get the court to agree that Owens isn't actually a member of the media, they might be able to shift the onus back to Owens so that she would have to prove the truth of her statements. Now that would be a novel and interesting legal argument that would increase the chances of their prevailing, and at the minimum make it more expensive for Owens. But it's likely that if the court accepts that Owens is in fact a member of the media, as opposed to just a conspiracy theorist and opportunist, the onus would be on the Macrons to prove that Owens' statements were false, which is probably why the Macrons spent about 100 pages of their 219-page complaint laying out what Candace's claims were and why they're demonstrably false. Though either way, Candace Owens is already using this as an opportunity to fundraise.
Will Wallace writes, I'm also a sponsor. I'm going to sponsor you right into winning this case. We have to let the world know not to mess with Americans, especially our women and children. Thank you guys. And we have seen this just definitely an uptick in donations.
And frankly, I would love to find out who's representing her in this suit, because she is doing everything you don't want a client to do, starting with doing a 2-hour interview with Tucker Carlson. In the relevant portion of this interview, she says that she's not going to dismiss this suit, or not going to even try to dismiss this suit, to try to get discovery against the Macrons.
So you're not going to try to have the case dismissed?
I certainly do not want to have the case dismissed.
Amazing.
Yeah,
I've never
so
heard that
we're having,
before.
I mean, we're having these
Guys,
discussions.
I just want to linger on this for a moment, having been around a lot of lawsuits. I've never heard anybody sued, particularly they're spending a lot of money on this because Tom Clare and his wife have big expenses and I think they charge a lot. I've never heard anybody say, I don't want a well-funded case against me to be dismissed.
And that's one of those things that you say that's like, I'm going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. Sure, I appreciate your gusto, but it's easy to say that at the beginning of the litigation, but when the bills start coming in, everyone has a different tune. Now, maybe the worst kind of client is the one that does their own research and comes to the wrong conclusion, but maybe the second worst kind of client is the one that has no idea, but assumes things are the other way. And Candace appears to be one of those people. She didn't know that any of this stuff is possible, but's finding out in real time.
I didn't even know how we could sue, actually. I thought that you could only sue in a country. I just am learning with everybody else
It's amazing
how this is going to work.
Yeah, this kind of thing has totally happened before. There are all kinds of examples of people who are foreign citizens who have sued for defamation in the United States because that's where the defamation happened. And there have been some pretty big payouts, including relatively recently an $8 million payout in Washington, D.C. There was a case called Chandler versus Berlin, where a man from New Zealand sued in the United States over publications that happened in the UK. That ultimately led to the second largest defamation verdict in Washington, D.C. history. Yeah, the courts in the United States are perfectly capable of dealing with citizens from other countries. Owen seems baffled that anyone would file suit in Delaware.
Because they did file in Delaware, and it is a place where we know that the courts are corrupt, but this would be a kind of precedent that would be, I think, almost even too crazy for Delaware.
Well, yeah, that's where her companies are domiciled. It is a totally normal thing to sue a defendant where they are located. And guess what? It's totally normal in the United States to file your articles of incorporation in Delaware. And on top of it, I don't think Owens has a good grasp of how civil procedure works. She talks about asking an attorney or defendants questions in a deposition of herself.
Do you want that to be your legacy? I ask him that genuinely. Like, I hope that we do get to court and I get to ask him that face to face. Maybe he's deposing me and I get to ask him, like, is the money worth it?
That's not how depositions work. When you're being deposed, you're the one that's going to have to answer all of the questions. And you can try to ask questions of other people, but you're not going to get a response. And of course, she says she doesn't care about the money and that she has truth on her side.
You're talking about a sitting president of another country coming in and saying, I'm going to sue you for telling the truth.
I am skeptical that she has the truth on her side. Extremely, extremely skeptical. But it's very easy to say that you don't care about money, until the lawyers' bills start pouring in. And ultimately, if there is a multi-million-dollar verdict against you, I think you're going to start caring about the money at that point. And look, this is not going to be the easiest case for the Macrons to win, but Candace Owens seems to be doing absolutely everything that she can between publicizing the allegations, between giving interviews post-lawsuit, and making every kind of incriminating statement you could possibly make in the context of a defamation suit. She's doing everything that she possibly can to give this to the Macrons. But there's always this Streisand effect. So far, it seems like the Macrons' lawsuit has backfired, making them and the conspiracies about them even more of a topic of conversation. And Owens certainly hasn't stopped talking about it. She's already posted several more hours of videos and podcasts doubling down on all of her conspiracy theories about the Macrons and even expanding the mythology a little bit more.
What's going on in France? Brigitte Macron Emmanuel suing Candace Owens because she's getting close to finding out what exactly. Perhaps that all of it's really connected. Epstein, Brigitte, Ghislaine. Suddenly the world seems to be dialed into that fact, and things are reaching a bit of a fever pitch.
And there it is. Bingo. Congratulations, and I'm sorry for playing MAGA bingo. Now, if you're the subject of MAGA bingo and a defamatory MAGA conspiracy, you're going to want a good lawyer. Speaking of which, here's the founder and head partner of a great personal injury law firm. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front and your lawyers only get paid if you do, to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.